$6,200 a month, 0 employees, 0 noise complaints, and every single system running in this backyard is technically the kind of thing most HOAs have already banned outright. No commercial growing, no unpermitted structures, no visible business activity. And yet none of these 5 systems trip a single one of those rules, because none of them look, sound, or register as what actually got banned in the first place. By the time we reach the 5th system, you'll be looking at something completely invisible from every angle, including straight overhead. Before we go anywhere, subscribe and hit the bell. This channel publishes one fully compliant system every single week, the kind that survives even the strictest covenant. And if you miss one, you miss how the pieces fit into a single loop that no HOA board has ever successfully shut down. Real growers, real numbers, no theory. Let's talk about why these rules exist in the first place, because understanding the rule is the entire key to beating it. Almost nobody who's had a covenant violation letter actually understands why the rule exists. They assume it's arbitrary, a board with too much power and too little to do. It isn't. Every backyard restriction traces back to one of 4 specific complaint categories, and once you understand the 4, you understand exactly how to build something that never touches any of them. The first category is noise. Livestock, generators, machinery, anything that produces a sound a neighbor didn't sign up for. This is far and away the most common source of covenant enforcement, and it's why chickens, roosters especially, and anything with a motor running regularly gets banned in the first sentence of most HOA agricultural clauses. The second category is visual. Structures that weren't approved through architectural review, clutter, anything that changes the sightline from a neighbor's yard or the street. A greenhouse, a shed, a fence taller than the covenant allows. All of it falls here, and this is the category that kills more backyard business ideas than any other, because most income systems assume you need to build something to run them. The third category is liability. Water features, in-ground structures, anything that creates a risk exposure the HOA's insurance carrier would rather not underwrite. Ponds get banned constantly, not because anyone dislikes fish, but because a body of standing water is a liability line item. And the fourth category is commercial use itself. Foot traffic, delivery vehicles, signage, anything that makes the property look and function like a business rather than a residence, regardless of what's actually being grown or made inside it. Notice what these 4 categories have in common. Every single one of them is triggered by observation. A neighbor hearing something, seeing something, or noticing traffic patterns that don't match a normal residence. None of the 4 categories care, on paper, what's actually being produced or how much money it generates. A covenant board has never once fined someone for earning too much money quietly. They've fined people for the rooster, the shed, the pond, the delivery van, which means the entire enforcement mechanism depends on something being observable in the first place. And that single insight is the foundation everything else in this video is built on. Here's the thesis this entire video is built on. Every system I'm about to walk you through was chosen specifically because it fails to trigger even one of those 4 categories. Not because it's a clever workaround or a legal gray area, because it genuinely doesn't produce noise, doesn't require a new structure, doesn't create a liability exposure, and doesn't generate any visible commercial activity at all. 5 systems, 0 triggers, 1 backyard that reads as nothing more than someone who's really into container gardening. It's worth being honest about something here too. This isn't about hiding a business from a board that has every right to know what's happening on a property. It's about the simple fact that most covenant language was written decades ago, aimed squarely at the visible, noisy, structural problems that generated actual complaints. Chickens at dawn, an unpermitted shed, a swimming pool nobody approved. Nobody drafting that language in a suburban development office was thinking about scion wood shipped in a padded envelope or moss cultivated in a shade corner nobody else wants. The systems on this list aren't loopholes exploiting a badly written rule. They're activities the rule was simply never written to address in the first place, because they don't produce any of the effects the rule exists to prevent. Let's start with the one that lays the foundation for everything else. System 1. The bench that looks like a hobby. System 1 lives on a simple bench running along one fence line, and if a board member walked the property line and looked directly at it, they would see exactly what it appears to be: someone's container garden hobby. Nothing more. Bonsai and dwarf specimen trees. Income range: $600 to $1,000 a month. Startup: $150 to $300. Bonsai and other dwarf-trained specimen trees are, by design, grown in containers on a bench or shelf, not in the ground. That single fact matters enormously here, because container gardening is one of the most universally protected activities across HOA covenants everywhere. Nobody has ever received a violation notice for having potted plants on a bench. It's the single most invisible form of horticulture that exists, and it happens to also be one of the most valuable per square foot of bench space. A trained specimen tree, whether it's a traditional bonsai species or a dwarf conifer or maple, styled in the same tradition, takes years to develop real character and value, but the training work itself, wiring branches, staged pruning, repotting on a schedule, happens in short, quiet sessions that produce no noise and no mess, visible beyond the bench itself. The value climbs steadily the longer a specimen has been trained, which means a bench holding a dozen trees at different stages of development represents a genuinely appreciating inventory, not a static one. Picture a grower outside Sacramento, California, an area with a strong bonsai and specimen tree collector community built around a regional club that meets monthly. He runs a bench of maybe 15 specimens at varying stages, sells a handful of the most developed trees each season directly to collectors who found him through the club, and keeps younger stock developing in the background for future seasons. His monthly average, smoothed across a full year of sporadic but high-value sales, lands consistently in the $600 to $1,000 range. Startup runs $150 to $300 for starter stock in nursery containers, training wire, and a handful of quality display pots, since presentation genuinely affects sale price in this market more than almost any other system on this list. The container itself deserves more attention than most beginners give it. In the specimen tree world, the pot isn't packaging, it's part of the product, and a well-chosen, well-proportioned display container can noticeably raise what a buyer is willing to pay for an identical tree compared to the same specimen sitting in a plain plastic nursery pot. Serious growers budget for quality containers as a real cost of doing business, not an afterthought, because a collector evaluating a tree is evaluating the whole presentation, not just the foliage. The mistake that sets a specimen back years, not weeks, is over-pruning too early, cutting a young tree's foliage back hard before its root system has had time to fully establish in its container. A tree pruned too aggressively too soon loses vigor, sometimes permanently, and never develops the dense, mature look that collectors actually pay for. The fix is patience spread across multiple seasons, a slow, staged training schedule, light shaping each year rather than one dramatic overhaul, letting the tree's own growth rate set the pace instead of forcing it. And here's what connects this system to everything coming after it. Every pruning session, every root trim during repotting produces trimmed material, and none of it gets thrown in a bin at the curb. It becomes the first waste stream feeding directly into the soil system running quietly behind this entire backyard, the one we'll get to once all 5 systems are on the table. There's also a market layer to specimen trees that most people never think about until they're inside it, which is documentation. A collector buying a trained specimen isn't just paying for the tree in front of them. They're paying for a story, how long it's been trained, what species and cultivar it is, what shows or club meetings it's been displayed at, if any. Growers who keep even simple records, a photo log showing a tree's development across several seasons, consistently command higher prices than growers selling an identical-looking tree with no documented history, because that history is proof the tree wasn't rushed and will continue developing well under the buyer's care. It costs nothing but a phone camera and a few minutes a season, and it's one of the easiest margin boosts on this entire list. That's the foundation, sitting in plain sight on a bench that any neighbor walking past would read as nothing more than a nice collection of little trees. System 2, the fence line doing double duty. System 2 takes the exact fence line most of these backyards already have, the one built for privacy, not for growing anything, and turns it into a second income system without adding a single new structure. Espalier fruit trees. Income range: $700 to $1,100 a month. Startup: $100 to $200. Espalier is a centuries-old training technique where a fruit tree is pruned and tied flat against a wall or fence, growing in a single plane instead of a natural rounded canopy. Done well, it looks like ornamental landscaping, the kind of statement feature a high-end landscape designer would specifically request, not like agriculture. That visual distinction is the entire reason this system slides past architectural review committees that would reject an orchard row without a second thought. An espaliered tree trained against an existing fence requires no new construction. The fence is already there, already approved, already part of the property. All you're adding is the tree itself and a simple system of wires or ties to guide its growth, flat against that existing structure. Over several years, a well-trained espalier fills out into a genuinely striking, fully mature specimen. And mature espaliered fruit trees carry a real premium in the landscape design world, because growing one from scratch takes years of patient, precise pruning that most landscapers would rather not wait for themselves. There's a grower outside Charlotte, North Carolina, running a row of espaliered apple and pear trees along a back fence that was already standard issue when he moved in. He sells mature, fully trained specimens directly to landscape designers, sourcing statement pieces for high-end residential clients, and he supplements that with smaller sales of young, partially trained trees to homeowners who want to start their own espalier and are willing to pay for a tree that's already a season or two ahead. His monthly average, spread across a selling season, concentrated in fall and early spring when trees transplant best, lands in the $700 to $1,100 range. Startup is modest, $100 to $200 for young trees and basic training wire and ties, since the fence itself, the most expensive part of the whole setup, is already built. The mistake that quietly damages a tree over several seasons, and it's easy to miss because the damage is gradual, is improper tie spacing that girdles a branch as it thickens with age. A tie set correctly for a young, thin branch becomes a tourniquet 2 years later if it's never loosened, cutting off the branch's own vascular flow and eventually killing growth beyond that point. The fix costs nothing but a seasonal walkthrough. Loosen and retie every tie point at least once a year as the tree grows, checking for any tie that's started to bite into the bark. And here's the connection that makes this system nearly free to run alongside the first. It uses the exact same fence infrastructure the property already has, meaning zero new construction cost. And it sets up the highest earning system on this entire list, which draws its raw material directly from the very trees growing here. Timing matters more in this system than almost any other on this list, because espalier training is a multi-year process, and rushing it produces a visibly lopsided, unconvincing result that undercuts the entire premise of looking like professional landscaping rather than a growing operation. The first year or two are almost entirely about establishing the tree's basic framework, the main horizontal arms that will define its shape for the rest of its life. Only once that framework is solid does a grower begin filling in the secondary growth that makes an espalier look genuinely mature. Growers who try to speed this up by over-fertilizing for rapid growth often end up with weak, overly vigorous branches that don't hold their trained shape well, which ironically slows the whole process down rather than speeding it up. System 3. Growing with no soil, no bed, no footprint at all. System 3 breaks from everything before it in one specific way. It doesn't touch the ground at all. Tillandsia, commonly known as air plants. Income range: $500 to $800 a month. Startup: $80 to $150. Air plants are a genuine botanical curiosity, a large family of plants that absorb everything they need through their leaves rather than through roots in soil. They're grown mounted on driftwood, hung in small groupings under a covered patio or eave, or displayed in simple glass containers, with no bed, no container full of dirt, no visible growing footprint of any kind. To anyone glancing at a covered patio hung with a dozen small air plants, it reads exactly like decorative hanging decor, because functionally, that's exactly what it is. This matters enormously for the covenant question, because a system with literally no soil, no bed, and no permanent fixture attached to the ground is structurally almost impossible to classify as agricultural or commercial growing under most HOA language, which is typically written around beds, plots, greenhouses, and rows, none of which apply here. The demand side is real and growing. Air plants have become a staple of the online plant collector market and a favorite among event florists building installations for weddings and corporate events, where their no-soil, low-maintenance nature makes them ideal for temporary displays that need to look alive and healthy without a watering schedule during the event itself. Species selection widens the buyer base considerably once a grower moves past the handful of common varieties most casual buyers already recognize. There are hundreds of distinct Tillandsia species and cultivars, ranging from tiny specimens smaller than a thumbnail to large, dramatic plants over a foot across, and serious collectors specifically seek out rarer or unusual species rather than the common types sold in big-box stores. A grower who builds a diverse collection, rather than propagating a single common variety at volume, opens up sales to the collector segment of the market, which tends to pay meaningfully more per plant than the casual decor buyer. A grower outside Tampa, Florida, runs a modest collection hung entirely under a covered lanai, propagating offshoots, called pups, from mature plants and selling both individual specimens and small mounted arrangements through an online shop, with a meaningful portion of her sales going to event florists who order in bulk ahead of wedding season. Her monthly average sits in the $500 to $800 range, climbing noticeably in the months leading into peak wedding season. Startup is low, $80 to $150 for initial stock plants and mounting materials, driftwood pieces and simple wire or glue mounts. The mistake that kills air plants faster than almost any other error, and it's counterintuitive because it comes from good intentions, is overwatering. New growers assume a plant needs soaking the way a potted plant does. But air plants absorb moisture through their leaves in a mist and dry cycle, and sitting in standing water or being soaked too frequently causes rot at the base, which is usually fatal and often not obvious until it's too late to save the plant. The fix is a strict schedule. Mist thoroughly, then let the plant dry completely before the next misting, never letting water pool in the base. And because this entire system requires zero ground footprint, hanging instead from an existing covered structure, it frees up every inch of bed space in this backyard for the next system, without a single square foot of competition between the two. Propagation speed is what makes this system genuinely scalable, rather than a slow curiosity. A healthy, mature air plant regularly produces offshoot pups around its base, and once a pup reaches roughly a third the size of its parent, it can be gently separated and grown on as an entirely new, sellable plant. A single, well-maintained collection compounds this way season after season, each mature plant quietly generating multiple future plants without any new stock purchase, which means the ongoing cost of running this system trends toward almost nothing beyond time and water, while the sellable inventory keeps expanding on its own. System 4. The shade corner every other system ignores. System 4 occupies the one part of a typical backyard that almost every other growing system actively avoids: the deep shade corner, where sunlight rarely reaches and most plants struggle. Moss and lichen cultivation. Income range, $500 to $900 a month. Startup, $60 to $120. Most gardening advice treats a deep shade corner as a problem to solve, something to work around with shade-tolerant ornamentals that still underperform compared to anything grown in full sun. This system flips that completely. Moss doesn't just tolerate deep shade, it needs it, along with consistent moisture, conditions that make most of a typical yard unusable for growing anything commercially valuable. A dedicated grower cultivates several moss varieties directly in that dead space, encouraging dense mat growth on rocks, logs, or simply in prepared shaded ground, harvesting sections for sale without ever competing with any other system on this property for prime growing real estate. The demand for cultivated moss has grown substantially alongside the terrarium and moss wall trend in interior design. Terrarium hobbyists need small quantities of healthy, pest-free moss regularly, and interior designers building living moss wall installations for offices and high-end residential spaces need it in much larger quantities, sourced from a reliable grower rather than harvested unsustainably from wild areas, which is both an ecological concern and, increasingly, something environmentally conscious buyers specifically ask about. Different moss and lichen species also serve different textures and looks that designers specifically request: cushion moss for a dense, plush appearance, sheet moss for flat coverage across a wide surface, and various lichen species for the pale, sculptural accents that show up in higher-end terrarium and display work. A grower who cultivates several distinct types across the same shaded corner, rather than a single variety, can fill a much wider range of orders without needing any additional growing space, simply by dividing the existing shade corner into small zones suited to each type's specific moisture and light preference. There's a grower outside Portland, Oregon, a climate especially suited to moss cultivation, running a shaded side yard corner that produces almost nothing else of value. She sells small packaged portions to terrarium supply shops on a standing wholesale order and larger cultivated sections directly to interior designers working on moss wall installations, a niche high enough margin that a single large order can outperform a month of small terrarium sales combined. Her monthly average lands in the $500 to $900 range, with occasional spikes tied to larger installation orders. Startup is minimal, $60 to $120 for starter moss culture and basic propagation trays, since the growing space itself, the shade corner, was already sitting unused. The mistake that can wipe out a moss colony in a single afternoon, and it's tempting because a healthy patch looks abundant, is harvesting too aggressively, clearing an entire section down to bare ground instead of taking a partial cutting. Moss regenerates from remaining tissue, but only if enough of the colony is left intact to spread back across the harvested area. Strip a patch completely, and it can take a full season or longer to recover, if it recovers at all. The fix is rotational harvesting, never clearing more than a portion of any one patch, moving between multiple cultivation areas so no single spot is ever harvested to bare ground. This system adds real income by using exactly the kind of space every other system on this list, and honestly, most gardening advice generally treats as a liability. There's a durability advantage here worth mentioning too, one that doesn't show up in most side hustle breakdowns. Deep shade means minimal weed pressure and almost no competition from opportunistic plants trying to take over the growing area, since very little else wants to grow there in the first place. That translates into a system requiring far less ongoing maintenance than sun-loving crops, no regular weeding, no pest pressure to speak of, and a growing medium that, once established, tends to hold moisture and structure with minimal intervention through most of the year. System 5. The one with no footprint an HOA could ever observe. System 5 earns more than any other system on this list, and it earns it by being, quite literally, the least visible business activity a property can run. Before I tell you what it is, understand this. Every category an HOA covenant restricts: noise, visible structures, water features, foot traffic and signage, requires something to actually observe. This system gives them nothing to look at, because nothing about it happens on the property in a way that's visible from anywhere at all. Grafted heirloom fruit tree scion wood, sold entirely by mail. Income range, $1,000 to $1,600 a month. Startup, near zero beyond shipping materials. Scion wood is dormant season cuttings, taken from a specific fruit tree variety, used by growers and grafting hobbyists to propagate that exact variety onto their own rootstock. This is how heirloom and rare fruit varieties, ones that don't reliably come true from seed, actually get preserved and spread among growers, and it's an entire market built almost exclusively around mail-order transactions during a narrow winter dormancy window. It's worth understanding why grafting, rather than simply planting seeds, is how fruit trees are propagated at all in this world. A seed from an apple, for instance, doesn't grow into a tree that reliably produces the same variety of apple. It produces something genetically new, usually inferior to the parent. The only reliable way to propagate an exact variety is grafting a cutting from that specific tree onto rootstock, which means every single heirloom variety, still in existence, depends entirely on someone, somewhere, maintaining a living source tree and being willing to cut and share material from it. That single fact is what turns ordinary dormant pruning into a genuine preservation service, with real financial value attached. Here's what makes this the terminal system on this list. The espalier trees growing along the fence in System 2 aren't just producing fruit and landscape value. They're a living collection of specific heirloom varieties, and every winter, while those trees are fully dormant, they can be pruned for scion wood exactly the way any fruit tree needs seasonal pruning anyway. That pruning, work you'd be doing regardless for the tree's health, produces the raw material for the single highest earning system in this entire backyard. The transaction itself never touches the property in any observable way. A buyer places an order online. Scion wood is cut, bundled, labeled by variety, and shipped in a padded envelope. No customer ever visits. No delivery truck larger than a mail carrier's vehicle ever arrives. No sign, no foot traffic, no activity a neighbor or a board member could point to and describe as a business operating out of a residential property. Because functionally, nothing observable is happening there at all. There's a grower outside Asheville, North Carolina, maintaining a collection of heirloom apple and pear varieties, many of them varieties that have nearly disappeared from commercial availability, through his espaliered fence-line trees. Each winter, during the roughly 6-week dormant window before trees break bud, he processes and ships scion wood orders that build steadily through a wait list, announced to a mailing list of grafting hobbyists and small orchardists who specifically seek out rare varieties they can't source anywhere else. His seasonal totals, averaged across the months surrounding that window, land consistently in the $1,000 to $1,600 range, making this male-only system the single highest earner on the entire property. Startup cost is close to nothing, since the trees themselves already exist as part of System 2. The only real expense is packaging materials, damp packing medium, and padded mailers designed to keep dormant wood viable in transit. The mistake that ends a scion wood order before it ever has a chance to succeed is shipping wood that's dried out or has already broken dormancy, either of which makes it unusable the moment it arrives. Scion wood has a narrow viable window, and delays in cutting, packing, or shipping can push a batch past that window without any visible sign of a problem until the buyer tries to graft with it and it fails. The fix is treating the harvest window like a hard deadline. Cold pack and ship same day whenever possible, using materials that hold moisture and cold through transit, and never letting cut wood sit unpacked longer than necessary. Like the espalier trees it draws from, this system doesn't require a single new structure, a single sound, a single visible change to the property. It's the most profitable part of this entire backyard, and it's also the part that would never once appear on any inspection, any drive-by, or any complaint filed with the board. Variety selection is where the real margin gets built in this system, and it's worth understanding why. Common commercial apple and pear varieties, the handful found in every grocery store, carry almost no premium in the scion wood market, because rootstock and material for those varieties is widely available through countless commercial nurseries. The real demand, and the real pricing power, sits entirely with heirloom and regionally significant varieties that have quietly disappeared from commercial production. Ones that older growers remember from a grandparent's orchard but can't find anywhere for sale today. A grower who deliberately builds a collection around these harder-to-find varieties, rather than common grocery store types, positions their scion wood as something genuinely difficult to source elsewhere, which is exactly the condition that lets a mail-order-only product command a real price instead of competing on volume. The mailing list itself deserves attention too, because it functions less like a marketing channel and more like a members-only preservation network. Grafting hobbyists and small orchardists interested in rare varieties tend to be a tightly connected community, active in regional heirloom fruit societies, seed and scion swap events, and specialty online forums dedicated to fruit variety preservation. A grower who shows up at even one or two of these gatherings each year, bringing a printed list of available varieties, tends to build a wait list that fills almost entirely through word of mouth inside that community, with very little need for broader advertising. That community-driven demand is also what makes the annual harvest window function less like a scramble for customers and more like managing which existing waitlist orders to fill first. Let's add it up. Bonsai and specimen trees, 600 to 1,000. Espalier fruit trees, 700 to 1,100. Tillandsia air plants, 500 to 800. Moss and lichen cultivation, 500 to 900. Grafted heirloom scion wood, 1,000 to 1,600. Run every system at the top of its range, and you land at exactly $6,200 a month. Out of a backyard that, walked end to end by an HOA board member with a checklist in hand, presents nothing but a bench of little trees, a nicely trained fence line, some hanging plants under the patio, an unused shade corner, and a mailbox. But the real value here isn't just that each system avoids triggering a complaint on its own. It's that the 5 systems form a single loop, and the loop itself is what makes the whole thing durable, rather than 5 disconnected hobbies that happen to share a yard. Trace it. The bench of specimen trees produces pruning waste that becomes soil amendment, feeding every other growing system on the property, quietly cutting fertility costs across the board. The espalier fence line does double duty as both a landscape feature that sells on its own and the living source collection for the scion wood system, meaning one planted row generates 2 separate income streams from 2 entirely different buyer markets. The air plants and the moss corner both occupy space nothing else on this list can use, hanging under a patio roof and rooted in deep shade, meaning they add income without ever competing with the other 3 systems for sunlight or bed space. And the scion wood system, the highest earner of the 5, requires no new planting at all. It's built entirely from pruning work the fence line trees already need for their own health, turning routine maintenance into the most profitable product on the property. That's the design. Not 5 separate loopholes stitched together by luck, but one backyard where every system was chosen specifically because it fails every single trigger an HOA covenant is written to catch, and where the systems reinforce each other closely enough that removing any one of them would weaken the rest. There's a durability argument buried in this design too, beyond just the covenant angle. Because none of these 5 systems depend on foot traffic, none of them are vulnerable to the kind of slow decline a storefront or farmer's market table can suffer if a location loses popularity or a market relocates. 3 of the 5 sell through relationship-driven channels, club members, mailing lists, standing wholesale orders, that tend to be sticky and self-reinforcing rather than dependent on constant new customer acquisition. And the 2 highest earners, the espalier trees and the scion wood they eventually produce, are assets that get more valuable with age rather than less. Meaning the backyard's total earning potential in year 5 looks meaningfully different and higher than it does in year 1, without the operator doing anything differently at all. If 5 systems feels like too much at once, start with the bench. Bonsai and specimen trees ask for the least upfront risk and the most patience, and that patience is exactly the discipline you'll need before touching the higher value systems later on this list. Get comfortable with slow, staged training on a low-stakes hobby-looking bench before you're managing a fence line of espalier trees that double as a scion wood source. Once the bench is running, add the air plants and the moss corner together, since neither competes for space with anything else and both are inexpensive enough to treat as a low-risk second phase. They also start generating early cash flow while the bigger systems are still developing. From there, plant the espalier fence line, understanding it will take several seasons to mature into a sellable landscape specimen, and even longer before it's established enough to responsibly harvest for scion wood, without weakening the tree itself. Save the scion wood sales for last, once the fence line trees are mature enough to handle real pruning without setting back their own growth. because this system's entire value depends on healthy source trees, and healthy source trees take years to build. Laid out on a realistic timeline, this isn't a system you flip on overnight, and it isn't meant to be. Year 1 is almost entirely setup and patience. The bench established, the air plants and moss corner generating small but real early income, the espalier trees planted, and beginning their first stage of training. Year 2 brings the specimen tree bench toward its first real sales as trees develop enough character to attract collector interest, while the fence line continues its slow framework building phase. By year 3, the espalier trees are typically mature enough to sell as landscape specimens in their own right. And by year 4 or 5, once the trees are fully established and healthy enough to prune aggressively without setting back their growth, the scion wood system comes online as the final, highest-earning piece. Growers who try to compress this timeline, rushing the fence line or harvesting scion wood from trees that aren't ready, consistently end up with lower-quality product across every system, not just the one they rushed. The 5-system total isn't available on day 1. It's available once the slowest-growing piece, the fence line, has had the years it genuinely needs. That's how a backyard most HOAs would technically ban on paper becomes a $6,000 a month operation that no board has ever once flagged, because there was never anything to see. Now I want something from you, and it takes 10 seconds. Drop a comment and tell me which of these 5 would actually survive your own HOA's rules, based on what you know about your specific covenant. I read every comment, and the ones describing the strictest, most specific restrictions are the ones that shape which systems get the deepest breakdown next. There's a free 1-page cheat sheet in the description with all 5 systems, every income range, and every startup cost laid out in one place. Grab that before you forget. And if this is the first video that's shown you a backyard income system that genuinely doesn't trigger a single covenant restriction, subscribe and turn on the bell, because this channel exists specifically to keep finding the ones that don't. The backyard next door might already be running every system on this list, and there was never anything to see. Now you know how it's done.